Hello, friends, rivals, and members of the Frontline Club. We're the first Wednesday which does what it says. We always start on time, unlike every other meeting at this club. We know you're very busy. It's 7, and we will end at 8:25. We will run it as a public meeting. You're not going to have to wait till the end to your questions. You are the meeting. If you feel you're not getting what you came for, which if you're like me, you want a briefing, please alert me early on. Hello, I've been here, I'm very busy, I'm not learning anything. Please tell me that before 8:25. But I'm delighted to say we have got a panel who can really help us understand a topic that is being ignored because we're all looking in the other direction. And I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves in a sentence and tell us what we need to know about Iran in a sentence. And I'll start with Nazanin on the end.
My name is Nazanin Ansari. I'm with Kayhan London. It's an Iranian newspaper based in London. I'm also vice president of the Foreign Press Association. Thank you.
No, would you tell us what most important headline we need to leave the room with about Iran before we move on?
A social transformation has taken place in Iran, and change will come. It is not if, but when.
I'm Lindsay Hilson, the International Editor for Channel 4 News. I'm here on false pretenses because I have not been following Iran very closely because I have been far too busy following the Arab Spring. So I am here to provide balance and perspective from Egypt, Libya and Bahrain. And I'm going to leave it to the others to tell us what's going on inside Iran. And I'm here to provide counterpoint and context.
Potkin.
I'm Potkin Azamir. I do lots of things, but for the purpose of this meeting, I think what's relevant is I'm a contributor to the media about Iran news, and also I run a blog which is in English. I try to get the Iran news that I think is important into the mass media first, but if it doesn't make the mass media, then it gets reflected on my blog. So my blog is a sort of like a leftover of Iran-related news that didn't get in the mass media. And
your takeaway, as the Americans call it, your takeaway from we leave the room and we remember you were saying what?
If Iran becomes a secular democratic country, it will be a beautiful world.
Thank you all very much for coming, and good night.
My name is Saeed Kamalideh, and I write. Hear you. Okay, is that better now?
No. Are these working? Project. I don't think these are working, are they?
Yeah, just start with that one. Keep going. Right.
My name is Saeed Kamalideh, and I write for The Guardian. I cover Iran for The Guardian, and my headline would be, it's all about human rights, don't get distracted with nuclear issue.
Don't get distracted with what?
Nuclear issue.
The nuclear question, okay. Did you hear at the back? No, just. Okay, we'll keep working on the sound.
Okay.
And over to you, if we can.
Hello everybody, I'm Sanam Dolatchahi. I'm from BBC Persian Television. I'm a producer with an interactive show called Your Turn. It's Nobat Shama. It's a little bit similar to World Have Your Say, where people come and give their eyewitness accounts and their views about different things. So because of that job, we follow social media, blogs, Twitter, all that very closely in citizen journalism. And I'm going to talk about the current state of the Green movement in Iran under the light of what has happened in the Arab world, what has some effects, some interactions, and also the current state of what is going on within the government itself right now, and how the Green movement is interacting with that.
Okay, so let's split this topic up. Number one, we'll look at I'm going to coin the phrase Khameneiology. We had Kremlinology. Tonight we're going to do some Khameneiology, the rivalry at the heart of the Iranian regime, and then we're going to move on to the influences from outside. So I think that means, Lindsay, for now, we won't be hearing so much from you. But will you tell us about the extent of the rivalry today at the top of Iran, and if it's changed much in the last 3 to 6 months? And we'll go down the line in this direction, and then we'll hear from the audience.
I think the rivalry in Iran is not so much about personalities, but the currents in thinking that is between those who are for theocracy, for the ascendancy of the clerics, and those who are more towards the separation of mosque from state. And interestingly enough, we see the current of secular current within the government at the moment being taken over by someone like Mr. Ahmadinejad. So when you see a rivalry between Mr. Ahmadinejad and the supreme leader and his supporters in the parliament, including the Larijani brothers. It is more about the future of the Islamic Republic and whether it is going to be the supreme leader and the rule of the jurisprudence, or it's going to be more secular and the supreme leader would only be of a symbolic nature.
Well, ever since I can remember, since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, there's always been infighting within the regime. There's always been one faction fighting another faction, and then one faction gets eliminated. And the winner has always consistently been the supreme leader's side, whether it was during the Khamenei time or whether it's the Khamenei time. When they say that the supreme leadership is the backbone of the regime, I think they're correct. It's what's been holding the regime, and it puts an end to the factional fighting. Why is there factional fighting? Well, several reasons. Some of it is in the Iranian psychology. I think they say that with Iranians, as soon as there's three of them in a party, the party splits up, or you have four Iranians in a room and you have 6 or 7 different opinions, the differences in the rift at the moment is very serious. It shouldn't be taken lightly. The other reason I was going to come to is, in a way, unfortunately, Iran is a very rich country with lots of natural resources, so there's always a lot of greed about taking over, and there's this survival instinct that we've got to look after for ourselves and for our own faction for tomorrow. The point is that the most repressive organs of the establishment are in the hands of the supreme leader.
Right, here they are.
As a betting man, I would once again back the supreme leader to win.
The supreme leader appoints the head of the judiciary, the head of the military, the head of radio, TV, the head of Friday prayer, all the leaders of Friday prayers. He confirms the election of Iran's president. The supreme leader selects 6 members of the 12-member Guardian Council, who has to pass all legislation in which can veto would-be election candidates. So you're saying, forget the news, the supreme leader runs everything. Whatever we're going to talk about tonight, the supreme leader's got the deck of cards.
I think the supreme leader is the backbone of the Islamic Republic. If you don't have a supreme leadership, you won't have an Islamic Republic.
So the question about rivalry is moot. The supreme leader is going to win no matter who's snapping at his heels.
Unless the Ahmadinejad faction are relying on some force that we don't know about, which could be factions in the Revolutionary Guards. Sorry.
Yep, you nearly finished. I was just pointing at side. Do go on.
Oh, sorry. Unless there are factions in the Revolutionary Guards, which until now haven't publicly stated their backing for Ahmadinejad and is relying on them, if I was a better man, I would back the supreme leader.
I think that's what makes... is that right? Yeah. That's what makes this power struggle very extraordinary, because in the past 2 decades, nobody has exposed the supremacy of Khamenei as much as Ahmadinejad did in the past 2 months. Perhaps, thanks to this power struggle that was caused by Ahmadinejad, his hypocrisy, Khamenei's hypocrisy and his supremacy over Iran's politics has been exposed in an extent that perhaps was not even exposed during 2009 unrest in Tehran. So it is really very extraordinary.
So for those of us who've come for a briefing, this is the most exposed that the tensions have been in 20 years.
Yeah, and nobody in the history of Khamenei's 2-decade leadership has dared this much to publicly challenge Khamenei's power. Even when we review the 2009 unrest in Tehran and what happened in Mousavi and Karoubi, everything was very public, but perhaps not even as public as this.
But why is he doing it if it's so obvious?
Okay, we can get you a microphone, actually. Just bear with me. No, it's all right. We'd like to hear your question.
You asked me to butt in.
No, but why?
I meant it.
I've just come back from Athens, 5 days in Athens, and all the talk there in diplomatic circles is that this thing is going to explode.
Yeah.
Why is Ahmadinejad doing this?
It is definitely very likely that he might resign. There is this status that Khamenei prefers him to end his term rather than he resigning, because people, there is a verbal attack now in Iran to the deviancy current, as they call the Mashai and Baghai and other people, and they cannot arrest him. They are just making a verbal attack, because if they arrest him, there is this fear of Ahmadinejad resigning, which would be a very big blow to Khamenei.
And will you answer the gentleman's question? Why now?
Well, I think this was Ahmadinejad has always been very unexpected president. So it's not. But his hunger for power, and he has eyes on Khamenei's death. Ahmadinejad is relatively young in comparison to other politicians. So he has eyes on the period that Khamenei might die. They are thinking of that period now.
I think it goes back to Ahmadinejad's messianic nature and Mashay's messianic nature. I was one of the people who learned the news about the arrest of his exorcist, and I think he's actually really disillusioned, and he's got people around him who making predictions, and the predictions are coming true, and he really thinks he's got some messianic mission and God is on his side too. So I really think it's just based on disillusion.
And just back to me, the gentleman asked, why is he doing this? I think it would be useful to spell out what this is. I'm just looking for people to nod in the audience. Maybe everyone in the room knows what this is, but I don't. So, Sanam, in giving us your views, will you tell us how much of a this is, and what you think in answer to what the panel's saying? So please list what he's doing.
Okay.
He wants to take over the oil ministry. I've read that, but I want you to tell us and your view, and then we'll open it up again.
Okay. The first thing is that publicly the things that have happened that shows disagreements between the supreme leader and the president. And well, supposedly they are all allies and all that. So it has never been the disagreement so public. Like the way Said says, it is this extraordinary. And it is.
Want examples, please?
One example is that. Well, a simple example is that Ahmadinejad wanted to have his Ministry of Intelligence sacked, and then force him to resign. And then the supreme leader said no. He wrote a letter directly to the Ministry of Intelligence and said, no, I want you to stay in power. Now, within the constitution, that's the right of the president to choose his ministers, to sack them or what. Of course, with the consultation with the supreme leader. Now, there has been previous controversies. This one became huge. The reason that it became so public was because one interesting thing is that traditionally these things happened the way, like, attacking the president and all that in a very traditional places, like in mosques. There are some clergies that attack the president, and that they are saying things that the supreme leader wants. Now, what this time they are doing is that they are not kept to mosques. They are not kept to what is Moizagara? What is Maddah? What is Maddah?
These are people that sing praises, the adulators.
Yeah, it's not kept to only that. Now they are using very modern technology, like YouTube video, and there are a lot of blogs and all that. So they're publicizing it, and you see, and one case, one of these people who is a representative of the supreme leader, he was asking for killing of Ahmadinejad's head of the deputy, Mashai. So this shows that this is extraordinary. Yeah.
I think it's originally because Ahmadinejad's Khamenei is very worried about the growing influence of Ahmadinejad and his team in Iran's politics. They are relatively young in comparison to Khamenei and his camp and Jannati and all people who are mocked that they are under death rows and they're dying. So they have their own eyes on the future of Iran. They are trying to undermine the clerical power because they've suffered from it. They are. I have to disagree with Potkin. I don't think Ahmadinejad is very disillusioned. I think he's very clever in that terms of having eyes on the future of what might happen. So what worries Khamenei is this undermining his power. Obviously, as my colleague said, as Anam said, it's also about Iran's foreign policy, which is conducted by the foreign ministry and also the intelligence ministry, which Ahmadinejad wants to take over. But traditionally, it was Khamenei who appointed those ministers.
Okay, so I'm coming to the room in just a second. So the question is, what's going on at the heart of Iran's government? And Potkin, is it a power struggle because there's been two supreme leaders since 1979 and one of them is about to die? Is that why this is happening? Again, back to a question of timing. Is the power struggle because this is an old man and he's on his way out?
Well, that's part of it, but I think there's also, I'll go back to the messianic nature of Ahmadinejad's government. They really think there is some sort of mystical power behind them that is justifying them in taking things over. It's a case of these people have got too big for their boots, really.
I think, first of all, it's important to note that next year there will be the Majlis elections. And Mr. Ahmadinejad and his cohorts, I don't think they're so much messianic, but they're very intelligent. And they're able to ride on currents. At one point when they wanted to take over, he was running for elections, he appealed to that section of the population that is uneducated, the Basij, that are messianically, not messianic, but rather very much populist in nature. At the moment, the nature of the population, most of the population in Iran, is very secular. So now he's appealing to his message is becoming more and more secular. And for the Majlis, one of the plans that they had was to take over the next Majlis elections because he doesn't have the control of the Majlis at the moment.
I just don't think there's anything secular about a person who starts every speech with a verse that says the coming of the hidden Imam.
Yes,
what's secular about that?
No,
how is that trying to appeal to the secular section?
Yes. It's very important because by appealing to the Mahdi, he was actually transcending the supremacy of the Ayatollah Khamenei. That is, that the Mahdi, the Messiah, is even higher in standing than the supreme leader, and that was his strategy.
That's not what was said in his video.
Can I say something?
Yes, please. Then we come to you, sir.
Yeah. I don't think either of you are wrong, but I think the point is not so much that he's secular, but that he is dealing with the issues of poverty. And I think that the answer to the question of why now is partly because of the oil price being so high. And because they are changing the structure of the economy and getting rid of the subsidies which they had before, Ahmadinejad is able to use that to try and appeal to his core supporters by getting subsidies away from the middle class and the general subsidies and targeting money towards the people who support him. And I think that he knows that this is his moment to do that when the oil price is very high.
Thank you for waiting.
Why has there not been straight backing by the poor people for Ahmadinejad against the supreme leader?
I didn't say it was going to work. I said I thought that was what he was trying to do.
Okay, hold that. We're coming to the people. And Lindsay, thank you for sitting on your hands so patiently. We're going to ask about the government before moving on to the people. So please keep your question about the government, and then we'll move on to the Green Revolution. Sir, who's got the microphone? Madam, sorry, your pardon.
Well, first I wanted to correct something because I think it needs correction. When we say the secular movement by Ahmadinejad, well, definitely he's not secular because in my view he doesn't care about being secular or being Islamic. The thing is that this guy is so opportunistic, and now he wants to take power away from the clergy, and that's it. And it's all about the power. And nationalism, heritage, culture, ideology, everything is being manipulated by Ahmadinejad just to keep himself in power. And why, you said why this was so exposed. I think it is so exposed and so clear, this rivalry of power inside the regime, because he was one of them. He was a conservative, and he is a conservative. But then, so basically these traditional conservatives, they cannot silence him anymore because he's one of them.
Okay, and Sai, would you react to that? This is about power, not about a traditional row about religion and secularism.
No, it's totally about power.
Yes, I'm just asking the panel to react. Okay, off you go, Sai.
No, it is definitely about power, but everything in Iran is very ironic. And so it's very ironic to have Ahmadinejad as an opposition, but he's become an opposition to the as a supreme leader. Left, right in Iran has different meanings, so everything is possible in Iran. But the whole thing is that yes, Ahmadinejad knows that he's not very popular at the moment, so he's trying to exploit the opportunity of reaching to the people who are still in favor of Iran's pre-Islamic history. So this is
he's pragmatic.
Yeah. Okay, is there any disagreement on the panel? Otherwise I'm going to move on.
No, it's definitely a power struggle. It's not about religion.
Not about religion.
Yeah, the only thing is that now I have to just add that because of, as Nazani said, because it's going to be an election and Ahmadinejad wants to take over the parliament, so that's why it's very. And the reason that they also he wanted to sack the Ministry of Intelligence, it has something to do with the election as well.
So, audience, does anyone have a question about the government? Because I want to move on to what's happened to the people's movement since 2009. Yes, sir, you can have the microphone. I beg your pardon, sir. Is yours about the government? It's yours about the government. You're first, you're second, then the Green Revolution.
I think the panel has got a strange idea about I think don't familiar with the history of Iran. And I think you can't expect the Shiaism has been ingrained, and 95% of the Iranian people are religious. These people were sitting on their desks, they are harping for the democratic and anti, and I think it is the vitality of the politics. It cannot be, for instance, if you ask the Jewish state, Israeli state to forsake Judaism and continue democratic process and allow any Tom, Dick and Harry to come in. And also the other thing I want to ask,
not the other thing. Who do you most disagree with on this question?
Well, I disagree with all of the people.
Okay. That's your right, but I'm going to ask you to pause there.
Yeah.
So would one of you react to that? You're all, I'm afraid, branded as loons.
I'm Shia.
If you said,
I'm Shia.
Yeah, but you are not real Shia.
You keep the microphone, we'll hear from the panel.
If you said,
enemy of Shiaism.
if you said 30, if what you said 30 years, if what you just said just now, if you said that 30 years ago, I probably would have agreed with you. But what's happened since 30 years ago, that this religious crap has just been force-fed to people so much, and whatever you force-feed into people, people regurgitate it, and that's exactly what's happened.
Nazanin?
Excuse me, I am Shia. All my generation after generation were Shia, we're Sufis. So at the end of the day, it is not even, most of the Grand Ayatollahs are in jail. The ones who are for separation.
Yeah, are you saying they're not real Shias?
Ayatollah Burujadi, he's in jail because he is asking for separation of
Ayatollah Sanei, Ayatollah Montazeh, these are all dissidents. Are you saying that you can say that we're not real Shias?
And Saeed?
For a reason, but are you saying that the Grand Ayatollahs are not real Shias as well?
Saeed, and also to you, Sadan, and then back to you.
Well, I didn't really understand the question.
He's saying, he said, well, you say it again. No, you won't be very long. He's saying, you said it was power. Please don't write religion out of this country. Go learn your history, he's telling us. I think he's nodding. Please don't tell us it's not about religion. It is. That's his point.
Well, it is not about religious, but Iran is a religious country.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
I'm Shia, as not Sunnis. But we are. I'm a gay Shia, for example.
Put that on your Twitter. Yeah. Right. Well, that's why. Yeah, and that's why you're living in London.
I think prove his point that you're not a real Shia.
Okay. No, this is your fault. This. Go on.
This is all about Iran. That different generations and different people with different angles are living in Iran. It's all about religion as well. But what people are fed up with is to be governed by a religious government.
All I want to say is that what I'm saying is, because I'm a BBC journalist, my analysis today is totally based on all what their own analyzers are saying, their blogs. I was quoting totally from very Shia, pro-government, pro-supreme leader, and pro-Ahmadinejad bloggers. So this is very at the heart of their blogs, the issue about elections and the Ministry of Intelligence, and it's all in there.
Okay, that's enough from you now, I'm afraid. It's done very well, though. You've done very well. So if I can go to the back, this is closing down the question about government, then we're moving on to people.
Sure. So my observation is that it's actually not about Islam or religion, because 8 of the 13 great grand Ayatollahs are actually against the current establishment, the religious establishment. My question is it really not more about Ahmadinejad being an egomaniac or a complete maniac, thinking that he knows better than anybody else? A couple of things that come to my mind is that I remember an Iranian national team went to see him, and he started asking the members of the Iranian national team what's the diameter of a football ball, trying to make them look like idiots. So he was basically telling them that he knew more about football than them because he knew the diameter of a football ball. My thinking is that I actually think he thinks that he thinks that he knows more than the supreme leader, and therefore he should control the levers of power, foreign policy, intelligence ministry, and so on. And in fact, he might be looking to run the country beyond his term.
I think it goes back to what I'm saying. The man is really delusions. I mean, he's on the record. There's a film footage of him saying that when he was making a speech in the United Nations, there was a halo around his head, and the audience were just dumbstruck, and that no one even blinked for half an hour. How can you say a man who comes up with things like that is intelligent? This man is delusional. There's nothing more to it.
I think it's a bit simplistic to think that way. It's all rhetoric, and and he knows who he's playing with. He knows his audience, and you can imagine there are people within Iran, ordinary people, that are buying what he's saying.
They're not.
He's a master of
If they were, why did they try to deny it? If there were people that were buying that, why did they then try to deny it, saying, I never said that? And then it was on film footage where he said it.
Because he's not a maniac. If he was a maniac, he would never deny it. This is his rhetoric, and he's playing with different ideologies. I think that's a mistake media is doing to just some media portraying him as a maniac. It's not. He's very clever.
Now, we'll come back to Ahmadinejad. Okay, we'll come back to Ahmadinejad at the end, because there are many questions that have brought us in here tonight. This one is another one. What has happened to the people's movement since 2009? Lindsay Hilsum, you can answer this, and you've been terribly kind, knowing what you know, to say nothing about it. So, what's happened to the people's movement in Iran since 2009? Would you start, the whole panel, and then the audience?
Polk is going to disagree with me. I think it's been crushed. I think that...
I agree with you.
Oh, you do? All right. I think it's been crushed. I think it's an example of how extreme force works. And I think that we're seeing the same in Syria now. And I think that the Syrians have learned from the Iranians, and there have been reports that the Iranian government has sent advisors over to Syria and said that the way that you deal with this is by blocking the foreign media and by killing people. And that's what they have done. And so that has been pushed down for the moment. I don't think it means that it's pushed down forever, but I do think it means that this interesting division within the regime that the rest of the panelists know more about and have been talking about is at the moment a more likely trigger for change than the kind of uprising that we saw in 2009 and that we're seeing across the Arab world at the moment.
Yes, I mean, if I could only say that the green movement is dead. Long live the movement, green, white and red, which is the color of Iran. And I think, as Lindsay said, there is a transformation taking place. Obviously, the green movement, as it was in 2009, failed to take on the initiative. First of all, there was too much division within them. They had so many different kinds of messages. They didn't have one message. It was from where is my vote to down with, and it went on and kept changing. Whereas when you had, now we'll come back to Egypt and others, they had only one message. Mubarak has to go. Even Ayatollah Khamenei, when he had the Islamic Revolution, he had one message. The Shah has to go. But that was one of the problems. There were other problems as well. But I think the movement is still there, and this is the movement that Ahmadinejad is actually trying to tap into.
And back down this end.
Well, the movement has been suppressed, but we cannot say it is dead, as Nazani said. If you ask, there are a lot of activists everywhere, inside and outside. But the organizers, many of the organizers are either in jail or out of Iran. So the problem is that people's demands have been radicalized, also thanks to what they have also seen in the Arab world. Their demands have been radicalized. Now, they have moved from the reform demands to a kind of demanding for revolution, but they are not doing anything because they don't know what is the next step, and the leaders, the so-called leaders, are not putting any way for them. For example, all they know is that going to the streets is not going to be enough. So in terms of one last protest that they had in solidarity with what's going on with the Arab world, so everybody was surprised that so many people went to the streets, but they didn't know what to do next. So
I agree with Sanam. I think I said once before in this panel that we have an expression in Farsi which says that it's like the fire under the ashtray. It has the power, it has the potential, but it just don't fill it. And then I think the question is that what would have changed if we had Mousavi as a president? Perhaps not very much. There has been a very big achievement in this whole process since 2009. The people have been matured politically, and that is a very big achievement, I think. It has not been, it has been suppressed, as Sanam said, but it has not been killed completely.
Well, I disagree with Lindsay that she thought I was going to disagree with her. I I think obviously I'll be lying to say that the Green Movement wasn't repressed. The repression in Iran was very, very bad. I mean, we can talk and compare it with what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, because I think compared to Tunisia and Egypt, I mean, they were just like kindergarten stuff compared to the repression in Iran. I mean, after 1 year of continuous protests, after a lot of people paying the cost of their protests very heavily, they lost confidence in the fact that they could change things, because not one single concession was gained. I think actually the opposition outside Iran had a very, very negative role. Just the sort of things that Nazanin's been talking about. Oh, they don't have the unity of this, and Mousavi did this in the 60s, and this, and etc., etc., etc. You couldn't have any better than this. This was the best show that could possibly put up. But if the repression is put down a movement, it doesn't mean the movement is dead. The movement can come up again if an opportunity arises. Some sort of opportunity arose after the Arab Spring. The people's hopes were rejuvenated again, which led to the protests from 14th of February, which followed for the next 2 weeks. Then, unfortunately, we had the Iranian New Year holidays coming up, and nothing ever happens during the Iranian New Year holidays. It's never, ever happened in the entire history of Iran. You will not find any historic moments during the Iranian New Year holiday. And then the people were watching to see what happens in Libya and Syria. They were saying, like, if a dictator really goes the full whack, will he be able to survive? And they're actually sort of wait and see what happens then. Because if Syria, if Bashar Assad and if Gaddafi manage to stay on power, they will say, well, the mullahs in Iran, they will go the full whack as well, and we haven't got a chance. So they wait and see what happens. And then the next thing that's happening is the rift. The factional fighting which is happening. So for now they're saying, well, why should we risk things now? Let's wait this out. Let's see what happens in this factional fighting. And
Hi, I'm Cindy Maceda from the Kensington Chelsea Women's Club, International Women's Club of London. Last October we had Dr. Khonsari come and speak to us about the Green Movement. And one of our members asked him, what's going to happen if the revolution did succeed in Iran? He said, well, 70% of the people or 80% of the people in the government are already on our side, so we don't have to topple the entire hierarchy. The people are already in place, which is different from what happened in Iraq, actually, because they changed everybody. So if 70% of the people in the government of Iran are already pro-change and pro-revolution, Green Movement, why haven't the people of Iran taken advantage and do something since the rest of the Arab world are
because maybe
also...
Dr. Khonsari was wrong.
Maybe he doesn't represent the Green Movement.
Maybe he doesn't represent the Green Movement. And he didn't tell you that the Shah was going to come back. Interesting.
He actually said that the Shah is not coming back.
Oh, good. Right, well, that's one thing. Maybe he's not a reliable source.
See, it's one thing being part of the government and wanting to see changes, another thing taking the initiative and breaking away from the government. Now, we had some very brave diplomats who did this, but let's just see what's happened to these diplomats. I mean, again, it goes back to my distrust and my not liking of the opposition outside Iran. I mean, no one's helped these diplomats. They've given up their privileges, their wages, their pensions, everything. Their right to go back to Iran. They've defected. One of them who defected in Belgium, and he felt he was so much under threat, he actually drove all the way to Norway straight away, and then because of the Dublin Agreement, he had to be deported from Norway back to Belgium. We don't even know where he is today. Another one who's in Japan, for example. I mean, when he resigned and he left, they managed to leave Iran to Japan. For the first 2 years, they were working in sweatshops where the illegal immigrants in Japan work. His wife contracted TB while working there. I mean, their lives are just completely smashed, and there's no one there to help them. The Iranian opposition outside Iran, which is they're very, very wealthy individuals, they don't come out and help. They just talk, and they want to see themselves come to power.
And Sana?
There's one thing. It's not that 70% of the governments are pro-change. Actually, there's a difference. Nizam, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Actually, Mousavi himself, he claims to be pro-Nizam, pro-Khomeini. There's actually a rivalry that who is closer to Khomeini, who is more... So the thing is that, yes, majority of people who are believing in the Islamic Republic might be pro-change, but they are not empowered. Only a faction of it is empowered, which is pro-Khomeini.
Lorianne Updike-Toller, president of the Constitutional Sources Project, and my question is, let's fast forward a few years, or even a year, and say the Green Movement is actually successful, the government is toppled. Let's just pretend here for a minute, because that's what's happened now. And my question is, who is in place to take the revolution, or a potential revolution, through to constitutional options? And what would those constitutional options look like?
Saeed?
Well, it was assumption, yeah? It was an assumption, so how can I really respond?
Do you like this assumption? Do you want to be rude about this assumption? Because you can be if you want.
I think I responded to that in the question that I said, if we had Mousavi as the president, perhaps nothing great would have changed. It would have been a big challenge for Khamenei, because if the same situation would have happened, like Khamenei wanted to change the intelligence ministry of Mousavi, that would have been another story. But the thing is that this is why I think that there has been achievements, that people have been matured. If what we're seeing in Egypt, for example, now is that there's a big change. At the same time, people feel that they're disappointed that there are still same people, like the military are saying. I think the future of Iran will be bright with this process of being matured, and then hypocrisy of the leaders being exposed during this process.
Can I ask, and then we'll move on to comparisons around the region.
Can I answer that question?
Please do, yes, and then yep.
Well, first of all, I don't think anyone should laugh at that assumption. The point is, no one can predict revolutions. I remember 3 years ago I was here in the audience, and there was a panel that was trying to justify the Iranian regime, saying it enjoys very much of a popular support and everything, and we were being laughed at, and everyone thought that we're making an assumption which is just not true. So anything like that could happen. No one predicted the Syrian people coming out like this 6 months ago. Now, what happens, say for example, if the Green Movement manages to topple the people? Who's going to lead the transition? There are personalities, there are figures within the Iranian movement which have a consensus amongst the people, like Mousavi, like Karabi, like Nasrin Sotoudeh, for example. These are people who've paid the price, who've stood by their guns, and there is a consensus around these people. And just like Czechoslovakia, where someone like Dubček could lead that transitional thing, these people can then lead that into a constitutional change and into a future government.
And Nazanin, we're all in the room eager for information, and history tells us that 1,000 people were arrested as a part of the crackdown, which we've heard. Can you, just before we move on, can you all reflect on the nature of the crackdown?
More than 1,000.
More than 1,000. Well, will you tell us, what happened to the arrested people? How many of them were journalists? Can you brief us on when they stayed in? How many died? When they were released? Are they under house arrest? Can you tell us
of the whole 1,000?
Well, how did the grip? How hard did the grip go? Because we want to know the answer. Where did they go? These people.
Well, they were held in Evin, most of them in Evin prison, and there are a lot of other prisons that have no names. They've been tortured. I think one of the smart moves, quote-unquote, smart moves of the regime was that it arrested the managers and not the leaders, the symbolic leaders, Mr. Mousavi and Mr. Karoubi at the beginning. And by arresting the managers, the second-tier people who were running the Green Movement inside Iran, they crippled it. So there was no longer any ability to organize or plan as well as they had done before. As far as how many they remain in prison, I mean, they keep arresting, then they free some people, they arrest more people. So it's a constant arrest, freeing, constant arrest, freeing.
But I think that the other thing, can I say something which I think is very significant, is what happened to the people in the security forces who refused to participate in this. And we at Channel 4 News, we interviewed 2 former members of the Basij who had fled to this country, who refused to take part in beatings, killings and rape. And they fled for their lives. And at least one of their colleagues who also refused to participate in this kind of activity, the last heard of, he was in jail. We don't know if he's dead or alive. Now, we've only managed to speak to 2 people like this and get the testimony of one other, but there must be many more. And so if those people who were not even wanted to change the system, they agreed with the system, but they just refused to take part in the extreme repression, if they were fleeing for their lives, that shows how extreme the suppression of this movement was.
And if I may only add that there were also a lot of executions allegedly for drug trafficking, and many of the political parties and political activists were saying that yes, they brand them as drug traffickers and then they execute them.
More than 700 journalists on and off have been imprisoned, and other than that, what they did, for example, they crushed the women's movement. Women's movement, before even any kind of the Green movement, they formed some protests a few years ago in Iran, so they were very organized, and they could be like an asset to this movement, but that movement was crushed. Many parts of them, young women, young activists, or their leaders, they have been either arrested or they had to escape the country. So the people, very few of them have stayed in Iran, and they cannot do anything. They are fearing, so they have become very conservative. Within the previous government, the reformists, a lot of top officials have been arrested, and also, let's not forget the ordinary people. Some people who have been in demonstrations, very ordinary people, head of households, now they are in the prison, their families are in poor situation. Then a group of people formed a network to just help them financially to these poor families that are from small cities in Iran. Then the people that were part of that network have been also arrested. So it's widespread in all levels of the society, from the top officials and activists to ordinary people.
I think the main story now in Iran, for me as a journalist, is the status of political activists in prison. The difficulty is that there are individuals, and it's difficult for a foreign media to cover each single, every single individual case. But it is very tragic. There is this extraordinary, tragic letters coming out of prisons that BBC Persian, for example, has covered about a systematic mass rape of young activists who are in jail. There was this story last week that condoms are being given out by prison guards while they turn blind eye on these mass rape. Unfortunately, these stories are sidelined by what is happening in the Middle East.
But also the other thing, Saeed, is of course that foreign journalists are all banned. Now, far be it from me to say that foreign journalists are important, but the fact that they have banned us, I mean, I used to go to Iran 2 or 3 times a year, not at the moment because they won't let me in, and they won't let pretty much anybody in. So that is one of the reasons it doesn't get much coverage, and it's because they've got a lot of things to hide.
And also, things are happening on a daily basis. Like today, Halis Albi was killed, and yesterday her father died. The other day, Nasrin Sotoudeh was given permission to come to go to the jail. And on a daily basis, things are happening in Iran for individual cases, which is impossible to cover, but it's as important as
and heavy sentences, like 15 years, 19 years.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with what's been said. I remember watching a documentary about the Cray brothers a few years ago, and it was asking the question, why they were made so fearsome. And the reason was that the punishment that they were handing out was out of all proportion to the crime. Now, if during the Shah's time we went out to demonstrate against the Shah, we never thought we were going to get raped. We never thought we were going to be in prison, or if we were going to be in prison, it was never going to be more than a couple of days or something. The fact that ordinary, young teenagers went out in the street asking, "Where is my vote?" and they ended up being raped. I mean, it come to a point where, when we were asking people in Iran, "What do you want us to say to the outside world?" They were saying, look, it's come to a point where we're beyond fear for our lives. They were saying, we've come to a point where we're not scared of losing our lives, but what we're really scared of is our children not having the chance to live a better life in Iran. And they'd gone past that point of fear for their lives, but what broke the spirit was the rape and the long-term prison sentences that was handed out.
If one person should be mentioned now is 88-year-old Siamak Purzand, who was a journalist who worked for Kayhan at one point, and for the past 10 years of his life he was in prison. And just a month ago, 88-year-old, he threw himself down and he committed suicide because he couldn't take it anymore. In prison, they had burned him so much that neither could he take care of himself,
house arrest.
He was in house arrest, but he was in prison for over 10 years.
Yeah, I know.
And so 88 years old, and he committed suicide. And he could become one of the symbols of this new wave of journalists.
Well, like what Sayed was saying, what happened in Iran this morning?
If you bear with us, we'll give you a microphone.
Sorry, thank you for bringing him up. I think it should also bears mentioning that his wife Mehrang Zakar, who's a human rights attorney, had to flee Iran when they arrested her husband, and he was completely alone in Iran without his family and under house arrest.
And his 2 daughters.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say there will be people in the room who want you at the end perhaps to spell that name. So if you can hang around and help us out.
The tragedy is that there are hundreds of them.
Right.
Now, these are just the cases that I mentioned here. These are the people we don't know them, we cannot identify them, and which are missed in the whole.
We're obviously going to move on to compare this with the Arab Spring, and all of us are in the room for that. But at the junction of this, can I just ask you to reflect on this question? Perhaps I'll start with you, Lindsay, because you raised this foreigners business. It's very fair, is it not, for even a logical or an illogical Iranian regime to doubt foreigners. If you go back to the archive, as I have done, and you looked
1953 coup.
Well, bear with me, just I'll limp to my conclusion.
It's always mentioned in any meeting about
Well, I'm going to mention it. So the British and the Americans actively tried to undermine the Iranian government, and there's a memory in a country, and much as we sit on this...
There's more memory in you, I think, than in the country.
No, it's fair enough. No, do have a go at me, but I'm just trying to be a chairperson and raise the question about why there might be distrust of the outside world in a country where no, you can't. All the panel and all the audience can address this, but I'm raising it, and everyone will say it's a fair thing to raise. Lindsay, will you address that first? Everyone, and do have a go at me, Popkin, and the audience, and then we'll move on to compare.
Okay, it is an issue that gets raised, and it usually gets raised by government officials. But one of the things that I find very fascinating and amazing about Iran, and I have found it across the Middle East over the Arab Spring as well, is the way that politics has atrophied around this kind of debate, this anti-imperial discussion. But society has moved on. And so that the young people I've met in Iran, and the same would be true for the young people I met in Libya and Egypt and so on, are not hung up on that anymore. They are part of the modern world. And they see themselves as akin to young people all over the world. They watch reality TV. They watch quiz shows.
And you at the back.
And in Iran, it's the same as across the Arab world. So this thing, I think, is less relevant now than it would have been 10 years ago when I first started going to Iran.
And I do want all your reaction, including the rude one. See you at the back, though.
Just to add to that, I was in Iran 6 months ago, and I spoke to a lot of the youth that had been active in the movement, or to several degrees, some actively, some not so much. But there was a sort of a perception that they felt validated, that the outside world had recognized their sort of dissident perspective, and there was a lot of hope about sort of the question of external intervention or some kind of perhaps other submersive movements or things that might come from the outside that would help them in their cause. And I was just wondering what the panel thought about this.
Well, can I just answer this question about the 1953 coup? Because honestly, in the last 30 years, whatever meeting I've been to, it's all, you can talk about fashion about Iran, and then the 1953 coup would come up. Look, you've misunderstood the 1953 coup. The coup that was engineered by the British and the Americans, that actually failed. Then 3 days later, the clerics that were afraid of the secular Mossad there, they were the ones that actually overthrew the Mossad government. So the people who are in power now, they're the ones who actually overthrew that nationalist government, the government of Mossad, and then they're using that to justify their fear of the foreign world. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I think Saudi Arabia, aided by American hatred of Iran, no wonder, you see, if they let up, you see, all these Shias would be classified by Sunnis as heretics, infidel. They are not worth any purgatory.
So your point is?
My point is that their hatred of foreigner is exaggerated or increased by the Saudi Arabian with American money and pleasure.
My brother-in-law is Sunni, sir.
Yeah. So you are not a...
Right, and to you, to the lady there.
I will just to bring that point about the Arab world. The Arab world has mistrust of the Western world for one reason, is that because they see that the Western world is hypocritical when it comes to the Palestinian question. They would like the world to be much more fair.
But in return, madam, please keep the microphone. We are meant to understand the difference, are we not, between the Arab world and the old Persian Empire and Iran?
We're
meant to understand there are differences.
Different
so
cultures.
would you just address the question of Iran's distrust of the outside world, and then we'll move on to the Arab Spring?
Yes, I think there is a big problem with the Iranian regime as such, because it distrusts basically everybody. This is not only about the Arab world and the Western world. It distrusts everybody. And if you look at the foreign policy, you can tell. I think everybody else. As far as the Arab world also mistrusts Iran heavily.
And I'm going to move on to that after everyone reacts to what you've just said. The lady's saying that they're completely paranoid. Would you like to react to that?
Well, Iran. The thing is that Iran is building its part of its Islamic Republic identity based on distrusting the West and saying that demonizing America and all that. Well, all the criticism of the imperialism. Well, yeah, let's keep it assume right. But the thing is that Iran's problem is not really anti-imperialism. It's a rhetoric as an identity rhetoric. And as I was saying, that's why I'm also saying that Ahmadinejad is not a maniac. Mm-hmm. What Ahmadinejad is saying, the things he says in the United Nations and all that, he's using that rhetoric in order to look appealing to the Arab world and make it similar, represent that these are similar things, but it's not similar things.
And it's also about the hypocrisy, as you said. Iran's hypocrisy has been exposed by praising the pre-democracy movements in the Arab world, while crushing it at home. But at the same time, obviously, and no mention of Syria, as you said. But also, the West hypocrisy, like the British government and the US hypocrisy, to what is happening in Bahrain, for example, is also exposed thanks to Iran's campaign, to some extent. Iran it's always ironic. Iran has a hypocrisy in exposing that, but also thanks to Iran's campaign to highlight what is happening in Bahrain.
No, I would disagree, Saeed. I think that the Iranian campaign is the last thing that the Shias in Bahrain need.
Yeah, of course.
And in fact, the Shias in Bahrain are very keen to distance themselves from Iran because they want to say and to prove that their rebellion is like Egypt, it's like Libya, it's a pro-democracy thing, and it's absolutely not a pro-Iranian thing. And when I was there, they were keen to say to me, we are not Iranian, we are loyal, patriotic Bahrainis.
This is what I'm saying.
It's Iranian influence, and Iran tried to maneuver.
We want your views, but we have to give you a microphone.
And that is why I'm saying it's ironic, because Iran's focus on the Arab Spring is, you cannot understand that it's very hypocritical.
Okay, bear with me, everyone.
Iran is helping Palestinian and Hamas.
Thank you, sir.
They are Sunnis.
Okay, Saeed, can you come to your conclusion?
But what I'm saying is that Iran has a bit tried to highlight the less focus of the West on the Bahrain.
Okay, so
that is, it's outrageous to see a Bahraini official coming to UK and meeting UK officials without any media attention.
And
that is helpful.
And we stay on this exactly. Thank you for bringing us to this. The other question: what impact have the protests in the Arab world and the toppling of Egypt's and Tunisia's leaders had inside Iran? So we'll keep in this topic now. And I interrupted you, Potkin. I heard you breathe in, although not breathe out, I should add. So do be brief. We'll start this topic.
Briefly, I'll go back to that 1953 coup thing. Let's not forget the supporters of Mossad there were either executed after the revolution, and they're either in jail or they're in exile in America and Britain. Going back to the distrust, of the outside world, this thing that it's the Iranian government is pretending and it's using to justify all its crimes and everything. Let's not forget who supplied Iran during the war with Iraq. Who supplied them with weapons? It was Israel.
And will you turn to this question of the protests in the wider Arab world and maybe come back to that in a second? Lindsay, this is what you promised that you were keeping your powder dry for, so it better be good. What impact have the protests in the Arab world and the toppling of Egypt and Tunisia's leaders had inside Iran?
Well, I think that they've made many Iranians very envious. That's the first thing. But there have obviously been slogans out on the street, and I'm told at the funeral of this footballer that we had on Tuesday. People were shouting Mubarak, Ben Ali, next Khamenei. But this may not be the case. I think that one of the things which I find interesting about the protests and the uprisings across the Arab world is how little they have referred to Iran. Because to me, it looks like it started in Iran. But they obviously don't see it like that, and people are not mentioning Iran. And certainly when I was in Egypt, there was amongst sort of politicians and so on who were adapting to the new reality, they were still very afraid of Iran and still saw Iran very much as the enemy. And I think that the desire for democracy and the social change, which I mentioned before, that we saw manifested in the post-election demonstrations in Iran, is exactly the same as we've seen in the Arab world, and that is because of a globalized world, and it is because of the methods of communication and Twitter and Facebook and so on. I think that that's very real in the lives of all of these people, but the regime is too strong.
I'd really like to take up that point that Lindsay made, actually, because this is one of the things that really, really annoyed me. When the Iranian Groove movement used the social media to organise its protest, there was a lot of so-called intellectuals, or what I call useful idiots in the West, who started saying, oh, this is just the North Tehran kids, the affluent kids who've got access to the social media and all that. Well, when it was used in Egypt and Tunisia, none of them said that about Egypt and Tunisia. I mean, Stop the War camp, what's it called? Stop the War, whatever. Coalition. I mean, what a bunch of hypocrites. Look at all the noise they made about Egypt, and all of a sudden they're silent about Syria, they were silent about Iran. When the protests were happening in Iran, we were asking the Stop the War campaign, why aren't you doing anything? We're saying, well, there's no war in Iran. Well, there wasn't a war in Egypt either. How come you were so vocal in Egypt? And the thing is, the sort of people who made this accusation about the Iranian protesters being the affluent kids and everything, they were the biggest lie-de-dies I've ever known in my life. I mean, people like Galloway, for example, he's getting £25,000 for every month from Press TV. He's the 5th richest MP in the UK, and he's got the front to call the Iranian protesters as affluent kids.
Yeah. I think in regards to the social networking websites, what is interesting in the Arab Spring in Iran, when I look back, is that we've been wrong. We've exaggerated the role of social networking websites in Iran. I think the role of social networking websites, even in the Arab Spring, is very highly exaggerated. There is no Twitter revolution in Tunisia. There has been no Facebook revolution in Egypt, nor in Iran. And that was perhaps a good lesson that Egyptians learned from Iranians. And because I think in 2009, part of the problem was also there should be a blame on social networking websites too, because people were illusioned that they can sit behind the screens at home and do a revolution from home, which was not the case for Egyptians. They used it, but they went to the streets at the right time.
And is it relevant to...
Again, in terms of a briefing, is it right that Twitter, Facebook and YouTube are all banned in Iran?
Yeah, everything is banned, but people are clever to...
Well, the TV, satellite TV is not banned. It doesn't work anymore. Satellite TV is not banned.
It's banned.
No, but people have dishes.
Yeah, but
the fact that something is banned in Iran doesn't mean it's not there. Yeah. You have to understand the concept of...
Is this irony again? Is this irony?
It just means that it is irony, but there's always a way around.
Right. And I have to add something to this, actually.
Yes.
Well, actually, what happened in Iran was vice versa. What the people protesting, going to the street, that was the time that a lot of people heard the name of Twitter for the first time, heard the name of Facebook for the first time. So actually what happened in the streets made the use of these technologies much more. Yes, the affluent kids were using it, but the ordinary people went to the streets, and then more and more they heard about it and they are using it more.
Well, I was in Tehran in 2009, and I participated in every protest to cover it for The Guardian, and I didn't know what is Twitter.
Right.
Now, although that's looking back, can you tell me what impact the protests in the Arab world have had inside Iran? Would you like to do this, and we'll turn to the audience?
Yeah, I said it before, I just repeated that. Well, it's one thing is that it has made part of the movement's demands more radicalized. As I said, that a big part of this movement, they want to just reform, but looking at what has happened in Egypt and all that, I read in their own analysis, in their blogs, that they say that what happened in the Arab world has made our demands more radicalized and, of course, gave more hope to them and things like that.
I think it has also influenced the power struggle in Iran. Khamenei perhaps is making Ahmadinejad as a scapegoat if the Arab Spring hits Iran. And Ahmadinejad, on the other hand, is trying to distance himself from Khamenei to gain some popularity because of what is happening. I think they're both panicked by what has happened, and it had a very direct influence on the power struggle.
And just back to where we all began this evening, we were talking about the power struggle, and you're now saying an hour later that the Arab Spring has also helped fuel this power struggle that we were talking about earlier.
I think it's not completely, but a bit of result of what has happened. Ahmadinejad is obviously panicked. He's very well aware of his waning power in the next 2 years, so he wants to cling to the power, and he has his eyes on the next election, as Nazanin said, in 2000, and also the presidential election in 2013. We all know that he was trying to groom Mashai, his chief of staff, as his successor in 2013. That's now a failed scenario. That is not going to happen now because of what has happened in the past month.
Potkin, do you agree with this, that the power struggle is partly because the people are trying to work out, the leaders are trying to work out where to be if a bigger push comes than 2009? Is that part of the mix that we should interpret what we started the evening by talking about?
But first of all, just let me answer the original question, and I think Lindsay hit the nail on the head. What's the main effect of the Arab Spring on people in Iran? And it's really envy. But I think they're realistic enough to know that the dictatorship in Iran is much more brutal than the one that was in Egypt and in Tunisia. That's why Syria is very important to people in Iran, and people are very carefully monitoring what's happening in Iran, in Syria. If the Syrian dictatorship collapses, I think that would really raise the spirits of the Iranians that they too can win.
I think that there's also an issue of the geopolitical context because, as Saeed mentioned, in Iran, the official media has been very much in praise of the overthrow of Mubarak because they saw the Egyptian regime as an enemy. So they've picked their revolutions, and yes, they're very much in favour, obviously, of the Shias in Bahrain and not mentioning Syria because they're very against that. But I think that the overall effect is actually to weaken Iran's role in the region. And this is not a moral issue, this is just an analytical question. I think that Saudi Arabia has made sure that it's stronger through its invasion of Bahrain and its tamping down of that revolution. I think that there's nothing to suggest that the military in Egypt will have a soft line on Iran. I know they let those ships through, but I don't think that means that they're going to become pro-Iran. So I actually think that the Arab world, in asserting itself in this way, is actually weakening Iran in the Middle East, and that's a challenge for the regime.
And is it fair to say that the question that we all came to answer, what impact was the toppling of Egypt and Tunisia's leaders have, less than the toppling of Syria's would have inside Iran?
Definitely, less than the toppling of Syria's and less than the toppling of Bahrain's, which will never happen.
And let's go to the audience, and you first, and then you second.
Yes, can I just say I disagree with Lindsay about two things here. In a demonstration in Syria, there was a mention down with Iran. Yeah. So Iran has been mentioned. Iran has lost, and Hezbollah has lost a lot of support in the Arab world at large. And they are seen now, by the way, it's not an invasion by the Saudis to Bahrain. Why? Because of the GCC and because of the agreements they have. Maybe you disagree with them coming in, that's a different story.
And what's your...
You cannot call it
an entry.
Yes, entry, if you want to call it. Yeah. It's like the European Union, what the GCC is.
And what's your point in the nicest possible way?
My point is Iran has lost a lot. The Arab revolutions have affected Iran a lot. And yes, I agree with you all that if anything happens in Syria, the Iranians will be greatly influenced.
I think in the short term, Iran may have lost, but having all the petrodollars and all that, they could create a lot of mischief in the future in these countries.
That's true. And also the others have petrodollars.
And to you here with the microphone, and
they have better organisational capability.
There's about 20 minutes left, so please do use this as your chance if you haven't heard or you want to contribute.
Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign.
Welcome.
I'm a practical guy. I want to know that Paddy's asked a lot of very searching questions, and we've had some fairly in-depth answers. Whether they all make sense or not to me as an outsider, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, we've had a lot of information. But as a practical guy, I want to know what I personally, and people who think like me on the outside, can actually do to influence the whole question of basic human rights, which is the essence of it. We have this. We've talked about this power struggle. Will whichever wins, whether Ahmadinejad wins or not, will it make any difference to ordinary people's human rights? And if so or if not, where do we go from there? And by the way, I am not a fan of George Galloway.
And Nazanin, would you like to take this first? Because you kindly gave me tonight a paper from the Foreign Policy Centre, Iran Human Rights Review, Access to Information. The questions about human rights, whoever we're backing, whoever the West are backing, whoever they're backing inside, on the Twitter, on the Green, on the whatever, what about people? Are they crushed? No, regardless?
No, I think one of the facts that we learned from Iran Iran specifically, is that virtual revolutions can't take place. They have to be real for it to really succeed. And one of the other things, for example, in this paper, we've suggested is number one, there has to be multilateral action between different countries, all countries together. And also there are already certain policies, agreements that the Iranian government is a party to, that internationally they have to be made to abide by them. Also, I think one of the other things that the outside world can do is do more research, develop more tools for activists to be able to use the internet.
Is this a bit woolly in the nicest possible way? Are you saying they can't do very much? They can develop tools. I mean, what does that mean?
Yes, I mean, as far as the international community is concerned.
Nothing really. It sounds like very little, doesn't it?
Well, at the end of the day, if change is going to come about, it has to be done by Iranians themselves. You know, the outside world can support them.
So
the change has to be done.
I think the gentleman was asking, what can ordinary people do for the movement in Iran? Yeah, I mean, there's what governments can do and what ordinary people can. You were asking what ordinary people can do. And what I say to you is that never underestimate the power of international public opinion, the power of solidarity. And what you should do is no different than what people did around the world with South Africa, with Vietnam, expressing solidarity, supporting the movement in Iran, finding out the interests of the Islamic Republic, trying to identify them. Exactly the same sort of thing that's been done for Vietnam, for South Africa, and all that. And never ever underestimate that. It's very, very powerful weapon.
So, and then to you.
I think the outside world, as he said, is what the government can do and what the people can do. And with the governments, I think they should stop these future sanctions against people and the government. I think they should stop what they're doing now. And then, with regards to human rights, I think they should impose human rights sanctions. Instead of.
So you opposed the travel ban on oppressive people?
I think the travel ban.
How does that hurt the Iranian people?
I think it hurt because, for example, in case of Salehi, he was on a travel ban list, and his travel ban was lifted when German Prime Minister went to Tehran.
Right.
So what is the use of a travel ban?
Oh, so it's not being implemented properly, but it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it.
I think when we see, for example, Iran Air's flights for ordinary people now between Tehran and London being disrupted by this full ban and full sanctions, it's just affecting people of my generation.
I know your opinions on sanctions. You're looking at sanctions as just one thing, and the example that I can give you is, look, it's like someone asked me, what do you think of medicine? Does it work or not? Well, I say, okay, well, if you take Viagra for a headache, no, it doesn't work. It doesn't mean to say that medicine as a whole is bad. Sanctions, you have to say specifically one sanction. Some sanctions are good, some sanctions are not. You can't just say all of sanctions is not good.
I know that sanctions has affected and has probably disrupted Iran's nuclear activity, but I think it has crippled people as well. What I'm suggesting is that human rights sanctions, I think, as an Iranian, I want those people who sentenced Nasrin Sotoudeh to 20 years, I want them to have travel bans. I want them to be sanctioned.
Okay.
I want their assets to be sanctioned. And in regards to ordinary people, I agree with him, as he said, don't underestimate ordinary power. When we as journalists write about those who are on death row and to be executed, when there are campaigns for them, we see that we've contributed, we as ordinary people, to make Iran stop that execution. That has happened for Kurdish journalists, that has happened for women who've been on death row, men who've been on death row. I think that's the contribution we should continue.
Ahmadinejad being mystic, Mahdi, populist. He wants to really woo the populist vote, obviously, in Iran. Why, therefore, given where we all know the Tunisian revolution began, and all the other revolutions in the Arab Spring began, is he suppressing his obvious opposition vote, peculiarly, by upping bread prices, upping fuel prices? Forgive me being stupid, but surely he is anti-wooing his obvious vote.
Okay, I think it's actually very complicated, because I looked at this issue because I was also totally confused, like you, about this. As I looked at it, what seems to be happening is you've got a general subsidy across staple foods, and that benefits the middle class, as a general subsidy always does. So what he's done is he's taken off that general subsidy, and instead of the money going on that, it's supposed to go directly to the poor. So instead of the middle class, i.e. everybody getting the subsidy, he's putting money into the bank accounts of the poor. Now, so he's actually trying to give money to the poor and not to the middle class.
But that's just a window dressing.
Let me finish.
To the bread shop, and instead of free,
I'm not saying it works.
You pay for it.
I'm not saying it works.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's a good idea, but I'm saying that is my understanding of what he is trying to do.
Look,
okay.
That's the window dressing.
Okay,
that's the window dressing.
And other voices.
That's how he's presenting this to the.
And let's hear some other voices. So you have the microphone.
I'm Tom Fenton, American journalist. I want to go back to something that Lindsay touched on, talking about Basij, who defected. One thing we seem to have learned from all the Arab uprisings is that the role of the forces of order is primordial.
Yes.
Absolutely essential. In Tunisia, they refused to fire on the people, and the government lost. In Egypt, they refused to fire on the people, and in fact, the army won, but it's supposedly there was a revolution there. In Tunisia, the army is split, and you have a civil war. In Syria, the army fires on the people, and you know what's happening. What is the situation in Iran, does anybody know, with the Pasdaran, with the Basij, and with the regular military forces?
Would you like to take that in turn?
Well, the situation with the revolution, I mean, the split that you see between Ahmadinejad and Ahmadinejad's people and the supreme leaders and the Larijani's, the same split is taking place inside the intelligence agencies, inside the Pasdaran. And I think one of the problems that they're facing is that the power, they all have all the same amount of power. And that is why I think Ahmadinejad, obviously, since he's become president, he's really increasing his power. But that's why I think at the end what we will be seeing is an inevitable clash taking place. And when I'm saying that if change is going to come, it has to be from inside Iran. It is when that's Basiji.
Well, that doesn't mean if you've got international public opinion on your side, it's not going to come from inside. That's not what the gentleman was asking.
Yes, but once that Basiji, once that Revolutionary Guard decides not to shoot against Iranian people on the street, that's when change is going to
Lindsay,
happen.
can I ask you...
Can I just say something about that? Because I think that's right, but I think that what I learned from the interviews I did with those Basij is how complicated this is, because this is where religion does enter into it. And those Basij felt that by defying their lead, they had been told that their leaders got their instructions from the supreme leader, and their supreme leader got those instructions from God, and therefore by defying these orders, they were defying God, and this was deeply traumatic for them. And they wept as they talked to me. This was not just a question of saying, I'm a patriot and I will not kill my fellow countrymen. This was something much deeper for them, and that, I think, is one of the reasons, because they have gone through this religious system from, I mean, you enter the Basij at 13, 14, and this is a whole way of thinking. And I think it's extremely difficult and complex for them to change.
Can I ask you a general question? We're moving to a close. Forgive me. I know everyone wants chances.
It's very important because Mesbah Yazdi is the leader of Ahmadinejad, and he's the messianic preacher. Exactly. Exactly.
Let me just answer the gentleman's question.
Let me allow me, please. Okay. So he is the one that is actually the messianic preacher. Now, Mesbah Yazdi has turned against Ahmadinejad. So if Ahmadinejad's people... Well, he has turned against Ahmadinejad and is saying that, what have we done that we've brought this man and we've promoted this man?
Look, I'm trying to answer the gentleman's question.
Well, so is Nazarene. So would you like to finish first?
Yes, thank you.
But please be brief. We're cantering to a conclusion now.
If Ahmadinejad orders people to shoot, probably Mesbah Yazdi, they will think at Mesbah Yazdi, no, Mesbah Yazdi is against Ahmadinejad, so I won't.
Okay.
So this is the...
Ever since I remember in the Islamic Republic, you've got to remember, this government came to power by a revolution, so it knows exactly how to stop a revolution. Ever since I remember, the ways they've used to suppress any protest in the last 30 years, they never used the regular army. When I saw the regular army being used in Egypt, straight away I knew Mubarak as a loser. Well, I mean, you can't... The tanks are for a foreign enemy, tanks for war. You can't use tanks against people. You use soldiers, conscript soldiers. They're ordinary people. They will, after all, they will sympathise with the ordinary people. What the Islamic Republic uses is this is what I said in an interview with Channel 4 right at the beginning of the Green Movement protests in Iran. They've got an army of villains and thugs at their disposal who are not regular revolutionary guys, are not regular army or anything. These are real criminals, and ordinary people are no match for them. They're the ones that really do most of the real atrocities.
Okay, and Said, will you answer this then? Just generally, to give me at a general point. To pick up where this gentleman's question comes from, has the uprising and the reaction to it in other parts of the Arab world intensified the grip of the Iranian forces, as disparate as they are? Has it made them tougher, I think, in a general sense, without naming all the branches of the military and all the political repression?
I think, yes, perhaps the split is not big enough, but we see that in the revolutionary cause. There are certain people like the heads who are supporting Khamenei. There are certain people who are supporting Ahmadinejad, less and less now. And there are people who are supporting Mousavi. So I think there is a split, of course, but perhaps not big enough.
Okay, and to you in the audience, and then closing thoughts on the panel.
Sure, I'll make it really short. My question is, what is the role of Mesbah Yazdi and also Mojtaba Khamenei in Iran's future? Because I think they're kind of leading the whole government, but no one really named them or mentioned them.
Would you like to explain to us who these people are you've named?
Sure, Mojtaba Khamenei is one of Khamenei's sons, and Ayatollah Mesbah Yazdi is one of the biggest ayatollahs in Iran, who has been supporting the government in last 30 years, but in a really odd manner. I leave it to the panel to discuss that, I think.
Sanam, when you pick that up, two key figures have not been mentioned tonight. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, I don't know. If she's asking about the future, I can comment on that.
Okay.
The role, I can comment on that.
Okay, does anyone want to comment?
I guess Nazanin wants to.
Right, in that case, okay, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a blind alley, but would you...
Well, I mean, it is, as Mojtaba Khamenei is Ayatollah Khamenei's son, and actually they're saying that he was the head of the coup that took place in the elections 2009. And interestingly, Mojtaba Khamenei had his son here in Britain. So his wife couldn't give birth in Iran, she gave birth in London. This is one of the other things that probably Western governments can do to stop to support the Iranian Green Movement. But I think it is about the future of Iran after Khamenei, after he dies. What will happen? Khamenei wants it to stay within his own family. Okay. And the entire system of the Vilayat Faqih might change afterwards.
I think, as she said, there is a broader issue involved, which is Khamenei's death, as I mentioned at the beginning. Perhaps Khamenei's supporters are trying to toot Mesbah Yazdi as a successor, and Ahmadinejad's people obviously have they are trying to make it rather symbolic, so not Mesbah Yazdi as the leader. But in case of Mojtaba, I think, for me as a journalist, I don't know much about him. It's like a rumor to me, rather than I know some details about people who've been into Khamenei's bait, as we say in Farsi, But it's very extraordinary that we as journalists and ordinary people, we know very little about Khamenei's personal life. We somehow we know nothing about what is happening inside his house and then that compound, as we might say.
And to you.
Hi, I'm just wondering, have we heard the last of Hashemi Rafsanjani, or is he gonna come back?
And again, just brief, a previous president?
Former president, current head of the Expediency Council.
Have we heard the last?
I was speaking to someone who met him last week, and he was saying that he's ever so delighted about what's happening. So.
Okay, so now to the room and to the panel, let's have the closing thoughts. We all came in here. If you haven't had it answered, you can have a quick go at the panel now, free, because they're too late for them to have an argument back. But there were questions about what was happening within, what was the role of what was happening without, and I'd like to ask the panel to have some closing thoughts, unless room, people, friends, you'd like to add a statement, perhaps, that you've been burning to say, or a question that wasn't answered. Otherwise, I'm turning it to the panel. Sir, with the tie, you've had one. Tie man, you have a remark. Then the panel, your closing thoughts about the questions that brought us all here. Yes, sir.
Is the thinking of Khamenei's death? Is the Velayat-e Faqih a dead duck?
Can you repeat the question and explain who you're talking about?
When Khamenei goes, could one imagine that the Velayat-e Faqih, the rule of the Islamic jurists as the supreme leader, do you think that is finished and there will be the republic, nature of the revolution republic will have to change completely?
I think it's far soon to call it a lame duck supreme leader, because you were suggesting that whether it's a right time to call him a lame duck supreme leader. I think it's very soon to call it. It's very soon to call Ahmadinejad the lame duck president, rather than because we really don't know what would happen if Ahmadinejad resigns. It would be another scenario, and I think we are in a stage we don't know what's going to happen.
Right, and closing thoughts from the panel, starting next to me, if I can, with Sanam. The thing you didn't say, the thing that was said that was most important, your takeaway from tonight in less than a minute each. Go.
Okay, the one thing I just wanted to mention that I didn't mention was that's when we were talking about Basij and how they are all thugs and all that. I just want to say we should not imagine them as monolithic, the Basij and also the supporters of the government. The government of Iran has some support within Iran, but they are different groups of people, from the lower class to the middle class, and I know that with the subsidies taken, people are assuming that Ahmadinejad will lose part of his support, but I think it's much more complicated. So that's all I want to say.
Well, I think what I started with human rights, which matters now in Iran. Don't forget human rights, and then don't distract it with other things.
Well, I'm just going to repeat what a very wise friend of mine said to me 10 years ago. The Islamic Republic is its own biggest enemy. Never underestimate it to shoot itself in the foot. And the Iranian opposition outside Iran is its best friend because he always helps him.
The way journalists like me report the Arab Spring is that it started in Tunisia. But actually it's a Middle Eastern Spring, and it started in Iran after the 2009 elections. But all of these uprisings in these different countries are coming to different conclusions and going to different places. And what we're seeing in Iran now suggests that what will happen to the regime is not necessarily going to be determined on the streets, because we see it having all these frictions and tensions from within. So maybe we've paid too much attention to the Green Movement. Maybe it's what's happening within now, which is the real story in Iran, not what people like me were covering on the streets in 2009.
I agree with Lindsay. I think also that it is not if change is going to come, but when. And it's important how it's going to come about. Because right now I think one thing that has really changed in the political sphere is that the individual has become at the heart of politics. And one of the things that this paper that I co-edited for the Foreign Policy Center says is that for this individual to be at the heart of politics and to bring about change in a positive way, this individual needs access to information. And I think at the end of the day, I hope the change that comes to Iran is not in the model of either Syria or Libya, but a new model that will be probably Iranian and won't be so much bloodshed.
Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you all very much indeed. We've been listening to Nazanin Ansari, Lindsay Hilson, Popkin Armara, Sanam Dolachai and Saeed Kamal Deghan. Thank you very much indeed. And can I also thank you very much in the room, the best audience so far in June, and thank you very much. I hope you did get a briefing. Thank you everyone very much.